Hello, this is Maciej Mikos welcoming you to Eastern Express. In today's episode, we'll look at a declaration made by Vladimir Putin from the past week. Moscow has declared readiness to deploy Russian tactical nuclear weapons on Belarusian territory. Will Putin's declaration change anything in this war? Let's take a look at our report.
Russian nukes will be stationed in Belarus. Moscow and Minsk have struck a nuclear deal inspired by NATO's nuclear sharing program. Under the agreement, Russian nuclear warheads will be deployed in Belarus, but remain under the control of the Russian army. The EU, which shares over 1,000 kilometers of border with Belarus, sees the plan as a security threat.
Belarus can still stop it. It is their choice. The EU stands ready to respond with further sanctions.
Russia has been using Belarusian territory to launch missiles at Ukraine. But so far, the threat of a nuclear attack against Ukraine remains low, according to Washington.
I can tell you that we've seen nothing that would indicate Mr. Putin is preparing to use tactical nuclear weapons in any way whatsoever in Ukraine.
Heaviest fights in Ukraine are now taking place near Bakhmut. Attacking Russians have managed to make marginal gains in the area, according to American think tank ISW. There are signs that the long-awaited Ukrainian counteroffensive may be around the corner, as the Ukrainian Defense Ministry is calling for informational silence regarding a potential counteroffensive.
And now let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. On Saturday, Russian leader Vladimir Putin stated that his country intends to deploy tactical nuclear weapons on Belarusian territory. According to Putin, Russia has handed over to Belarus, among other things, 10 aircraft that can carry nuclear missiles, and storage facilities for these weapons are to be built by June the 1st. The statement provoked opposition from many countries, including Poland. NATO also reacted, whose press service stressed that Russia's nuclear rhetoric was dangerous and irresponsible. The Russian president outlined a plan for Russia to complete the construction of a tactical nuclear weapons storage facility in Belarus by July 1st. He added that Moscow would not in fact hand over control of these weapons to the authorities in Minsk so as not to breach non-proliferation. Belarus, it is worth noting, is a nuclear weapons-free state by status. Belarusian opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya commented on the decision on her Twitter account, calling it a violation of the will of the people. Storing nuclear weapons in a different country is not specifically prohibited under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and it's very possible Putin is not placing nukes for them to be used. Moreover, many experts take the view that Putin was seeking to deploy tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus even before the invasion of Ukraine began, with the main aim of these actions being to tighten the grasp of Belarus. Saturday's announcement by Russia does not affect the risk of escalation of the current war to the nuclear level, but is part of an information campaign to intimidate the West. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Jayson, Smart, political analyst for Kyiv Post. Good afternoon, Jayson.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Now, while more questions arise by the day about the spring offensive in Ukraine, it seems that Vladimir Putin is once again trying to blackmail the West by deploying nuclear weapons to Belarus. Now, do you think that this Russian move will anyhow affect the Western help for Ukraine?
So I think the move of Putin is something that we can understand as having two different sides to it. On one side, we have what he's trying to do domestically in Belarus. Keep in mind, it was the day of Belarusian solidarity when he made this announcement. He's trying to make a show that Belarus is under the heel of Moscow and it won't go anywhere. So this was definitely done for the Belarusian population, as well as for the international observers. They saw the position of Moscow towards Belarus. But secondly, yes, it's more of the nuclear saber rattling, which we've grown to expect, actually, from the Kremlin. This is what they always do. The fact is that the Russian military is not capable of launching a normal offensive or winning a war against even Ukraine. And so its only hope of trying to convince the West that it's a serious country or some sort of a player is through the use of nuclear weapons. And so I think this is one more of those empty threats. The fact is that Russia it's almost impossible they'll be able to build these silos for nuclear weapons within the time frame that Putin has given. This is just pure empty words as one could expect from Moscow.
Right. Now, as you said, the Russians are unable to perform any major military operations in the Ukrainian east. I'd like to ask you about Bakhmut. Well, Western sources claim that the Russian attacks on Bakhmut are coming to an end. Now, is it because the Russians are running simply out of soldiers, or are they preparing something really grand for the spring?
I think they're running out of soldiers. The fact is that Russia is burning through soldiers at a rate that's unsustainable. As we've seen, Prigozhin's Wagner group has already complained that it's lost tens of thousands, and it's simply down to several thousand soldiers left in the Wagner group. Keep in mind, just a few months ago, this was considered to be a serious threat even to the Russian military because of what a large mass of soldiers it had. But today it's not. They've been destroyed. They've been decimated. And what's interesting is that Bakhmut,
from 40-something thousand to 7 right now.
Exactly right, to about 7,000 is the current estimate. And so that's a huge loss of force. And so what you have to ask yourself is, how did that happen? And I think there's a few different aspects to this. And one of those is that within the Kremlin, I think there's a desire by some such as Shoigu, the Minister of Defense, to see Prigozhin's army disappear. And so they are allowing their own soldiers to die due to internal Kremlin politics. Once again, this is Russia's complete lack of respect for human life, even their own Russian life. And that's why they're willing to just sacrifice the lives of tens of thousands of soldiers in Bakhmut, and it seems to be running out of force. And so, fortunately, it seems the situation has, to quote General Zaluzhny, it's become stabilized in Bakhmut.
Stabilized?
Yes.
You mean a stalemate, basically, because, well, on one hand, the Russians are unable to push on forward. Then again, Ukrainians are unable to push them back, so we have a stalemate, right?
Ukraine was losing territory, and let's be frank, it was not going really well just a couple weeks ago. But at this point, that's no longer the case. Russia does not have the troops to push further into Ukrainian territory. There is no possibility of that at this point. And so I think that unless there's going to be new soldiers brought from somewhere else in Russia, the situation there is quite stable.
Right. Now, President Zelensky claims that his country is still unable to begin this big spring counteroffensive due to lack of sufficient arms deliveries from the West. So, in your opinion, when will Ukraine at last receive all it needs to push the invaders back?
Well, this is the call for urgency that, it's being repeated once again by Kiev. The fact is, the Ukrainians are ready to begin a new offensive, to push the Russian invaders out. But at this point, it's really just a question of when will they get sufficient weapons? When will be there enough from the European countries to be able to support an offensive that preserves Ukrainian lives? And we don't want to be like Prigozhin's troops, just burning through people. That's not the goal. Ukraine loves its soldiers. And so the more weapons we're able to give to Ukraine now, the better it's going to make this offensive. Better in the sense that it's going to be something that's, one, sustainable. Secondly, it's something that's going to cost less Ukrainian lives, but it'll still cost lives. And third, it's something that's going to push Russia onto its heels. At this point, Russia is very weak. And we've seen the loss of soldiers that they're sustaining at this point is not something they can continue for much longer.
Right. So maybe it's not about arms deliveries, but about training of new troops, because as we know, Ukraine has also sustained huge losses in their military personnel.
They have. Ukraine is sustaining losses, as are the Russians. Obviously, the Russian losses are well known, and they're massive. More than 100,000 people in the case of the Russians. But the fact is, the Ukrainians are suffering losses as well. That's something that we're all familiar with. And also the new weapons that Ukraine gets, keep in mind, they need training. As you saw, the Patriot missile trainings, which would take place in the United States just last week, the Ukrainians just finished. Once you have new weapons supplied, you also have to teach the troops how to use those. And so this is an entire process. This is not just a quick solution where you call people up, like they did in the case of Russia, from the prisons and send them to the front. No, the Ukrainians actually are training their soldiers to be prepared to fight in a normal way.
Right. So when will it happen then? Is it a matter of weeks or still months to come?
I think it's within the course of a few weeks. We would probably see the moves in that direction.
In which direction?
In the direction towards an offensive. And where that's going to be is still unknown.
Right. But do you suspect it would be rather in the direction of Donbass or then to the south to liberate Crimea?
And the fact is that Crimea's liberation is something that I think everybody recognizes is not only doable, it's very doable. And I think within Russia that would be a great success for Ukraine in the sense that I think Russian society's support for this war might disappear. And if they lose Crimea, which was such a success in their eyes back in 2014 when they took it, this would be something dramatic. I think this would actually be a huge shock to the Russian population. And this might change the entire perception of the war, that Russia is no longer taking territory, but in fact losing territory from its constitutionally defined borders, which are not internationally recognized. This would be something that would completely change the game. And I have great hopes, as I think we all do, that Crimea will soon be returned to Ukraine.
Hopefully. Well, as we discussed arms deliveries to Ukraine, we know that Russia is struggling in this regard because, Russia is now unable, apparently, to fulfill its arms deliveries to India. Well, due to war in Ukraine, of course. So it kind of, and you know, with all the retro tanks that now they're planning to send to the front line, and it kind of gives us the impression that the Russian defense industry is on the verge of collapse. Or has it collapsed already?
It's definitely headed that direction quickly. And it's not something I say with optimism. We see the case of India being a good example of that. The fact is that Russia does not produce domestically enough of what it needs to have modern technology or modern arms. The older stuff, they do have lots of technology. They can produce gunpowder by themselves, for instance. But when it comes to more complicated things or complex things, we see that they simply don't. I mean, whether it's a GPS or something else that would go into a modern technology or the microchips necessary for guided missiles, Russia doesn't produce it. And so I think that the signs, these warning signs, such as them coming out publicly that they cannot fulfill the orders placed by India, is a sign that Russia's defense industry is collapsing. And the more it's getting pushed, and the more that the West helps Ukraine, it'll put Russia into a more difficult place. And at some point, I do think that the entire military industry of Russia will collapse. I mean, full-out collapse, where it's no longer able to supply even the most basic of consumables.
Right. So Ukraine's still planning on its major counteroffensive. Do you think that there is a chance that they will actually do what Russians were planning to do? I mean, to attack in many directions at the same time?
Everything's possible. The fact is that the Ukrainians have been very careful to not state publicly what they're planning to do, because, you know, the element of surprise is important. But I would say that it's something, one of the reasons that Ukraine's come out with new restrictions on the press, yet again, about what they can be discussed for reporters that work inside of Ukraine, such as myself. And so there's a lot going on that I think is important. And one of the most important things, though, is that Ukraine is increasingly prepared.
Do you think it is the calm before the storm?
Yes, I think so. I think it's exactly that. I think that Ukraine is preparing itself. And that's something that I think everybody sees. You know, Bakhmut's been stabilized. That means that now troops can be repositioned to wherever they need to be. That means that weapons can be spared from Bakhmut's direction and put wherever they need to be. This means that more weapons are being delivered by the day, literally by the day. It's incredible when you read news. Every single day, there's more arms deliveries from the West. So if you give it just a few more days, even more will come. So the longer Ukraine waits, within reason, while Russia is still sort of destabilized from the losses in Bakhmut, the more time Ukraine has, just even a few more weeks, that will allow for a significant shift in where they have their manpower and firepower to allow for a serious advance into Russian territory.
Right, towards the Russian territory. Where will they stop? I mean, after, you know, this first year of, more than a year of this full-scale invasion in Ukraine, well, you know, some of the Ukrainian East is very much divided. I mean, the civilians. Do you think it is still possible for Kyiv to hold on to these parts of Donbas, which are, well, rather biased towards Russia?
You know, I think the important thing about Donbass or any other region of the country, it's less about the public opinion polling at this point. The fact is the population lives under propaganda. What they see and what they know is completely distant from what is reality. And a lot of the people, especially those who are the upper economic classes in Donbass, actually, essentially the entire upper economic or educated classes have left. They don't live there anymore. Who's left there? It's truly, and you look at the leadership of the so-called DNR or LNR is, these are people who have virtually no education. Their top leadership literally is working into a car wash before the war started. Security guard at a supermarket is the other guy who's one of the leaders of the DNR. They're people that don't have a lot of background or education or anything else. Why is that? Because everyone that had the chance to leave left. So I think once those areas are taken back, those who are from Donbass, which is millions of people, will want to return home. And they have the capital to rebuild. They have the ability to start businesses to give people jobs. And I think that anyone that's sincere and understands what's happening would understand that the rebuilding in Donbass will only happen if it comes back to Ukraine. If it were to do something such a state part of Russia, obviously nobody's going to help with its rebuilding. But if it comes back, it's going to be an interest in the job creation, the rebuilding of infrastructure. It's going to be something that the people of Donbass, I think, will want in the end.
And, well, let's hope it happens rather sooner than later. This year?
I think it'll be this year.
Hopefully. Jason, Jay, Smart, political analyst for Kiev Post, was our guest today. Thank you very much, Jason.
Thank you.
And we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the latest stories from the East that you don't want to miss. Germany is planning to expel more than 30 Russian diplomats accused of spying. It wouldn't be the first such move from Berlin since Russia invaded Ukraine.
Germany is about to expel over 30 Russian diplomats. Sources say they may have been recruiting informants. Berlin security services began monitoring the activities of the employees of the Russian embassy and consulates more closely in the wake of Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. According to media reports, Russian diplomatic posts are currently staffed with more personnel than during the height of the Cold War. But the Kremlin may have placed operatives not only in its consulates. In December, a German intelligence officer was arrested for disclosing confidential information to Russia.
Russia has recently ramped up the use of Iranian-made drones in Ukraine. This has sparked fresh speculation over the partnership between Moscow and Tehran.
According to British intelligence, Russia likely has begun receiving regular resupplies of Iranian drones. In March alone, the UK's Defence Ministry counted 71 instances of Moscow using Iranian suicide drones against targets in Ukraine. This means that their use has re-intensified after a 2-week break. London says it's likely an attempt at overstretching Ukrainian air defense. Russia began using Iranian drones to strike Ukraine in the fall of last year. They have often been launched in swarms to overwhelm the Ukrainian intercept capacity.
Turkey, a strong supporter of Azerbaijan, is planning to open its land border with Armenia. The border was closed in the 90s over the war in Nagorno-Karabakh.
Turkey and Armenia are planning to open border crossings between the two countries for the first time in 30 years. Over 300 kilometers long, the border has been closed since 1993 following a unilateral decision by Turkey. The closure took place during the first Nagorno-Karabakh war, and Ankara made the decision in support of Azerbaijan. The border is slated to reopen early in the summer, initially only to foreign travelers and diplomats.
The pension reform protests in France have echoed across the world. They were noticed even by the foreign ministers of Central Asian states.
Azerbaijan has condemned the use of excessive force against French protesters and called on President Emmanuel Macron to respect his citizens' freedom of speech and right to peaceful protest. Iran, which arrested thousands of demonstrators last year and later executed many of the detainees, published a similar statement, calling on France to respect human rights and avoid using force against peaceful protesters.
And that's all in today's episode of Eastern Express. Thank you for watching and stay with us for more here on TVP World.